And welcome back, and thanks for joining us on this Tennessee Valley This Morning edition. And as promised, we have a very, very special guest today, Tennessee United States Senator Bob Corker. Haven't seen him in a while, but it's always good to see you, Senator.
Good to see you, Dan. Always good to be with you.
Thank you. Of course, we're just honored that you would take time out of your busy schedule. I think your assistant told me that you'd been in about 10 counties in East Tennessee, or 12 counties.
I think 12 or 13.
12,
but yeah, well, it's great. It's the best part of the job. I just came from Meigs County and sat down with a lot of folks there who care about economic development and really enjoyed it. I've got a lot of friends around the state, and it's a pleasure to see everybody and talk about what's happening in Washington and hear from them. So.
A lot of people want to know what's happening in Washington, and maybe you can enlighten us a little bit about that. Over the past several months, Senator, you've described our country as being engaged in the struggle of the decade. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, you know, it's taken us a long time to get us to get in a situation where we are, where we know that our financial house, our fiscal house is not in order. And, you know, we took a step last week with, you know, putting in place a mechanism to get about $2.4 trillion in cuts, a trillion on the front end, the rest coming in November or December. But, you know, it's going to take a lot of those kinds of actions to get our country back where it needs to go. If we did what we did last week, every time we have a debt ceiling increase, we would actually have a balanced budget in the year 2021. But it's going to take a lot of tough-mindedness, discipline, focus to make that happen, and a lot of really tough decisions.
Talk about that a little more in depth. We saw that the Congress had passed a reduction, a spending reduction, but then they increased the debt ceiling. You know, some folks look at that and they don't understand. It's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul here. Explain exactly how that helps us.
Well, the debt ceiling is a function of spending that's already occurred. I think the way to think about it is when somebody goes out and buys something on a credit card, they get a bill a few weeks later and they have to pay it off, and so the raising of the debt ceiling is about deficit spending. I mean, we have a $1.5 trillion deficit this year, and so if you're continuing along those lines, you're raising the debt ceiling. And so the question is, how do you turn that around? How do you move it back in a direction where that is not happening? And again, as I mentioned, this last week we took that first step. I would have liked to have seen personally a minimum of $4 trillion in cuts, and as you know, I had a bipartisan bill in the House and Senate that actually would have cut $5 trillion over the next 10 years. But again, this was the first step. A lot more has to happen. But as you have deficit spending and you're making cuts, you're still going to have an increase in the debt ceiling for a period of time. If we can ever get back to the balanced budget that I was just referring to, which this type of activity time over and over and over again over a 10-year period will take us there, we won't be raising the debt ceiling anymore. But that's why I say it's a struggle of a decade. It's going to take a lot of decisions, a lot of tough decisions. Candidly, things that Americans have been used to are going to change, in my opinion, pretty much as it relates to how the federal government spends money. That's something we have to do as a country to cause us to maintain the status that we have in the world, and certainly the standard of living that Americans enjoy.
Let's talk about those cuts a little more. Are these actual cuts, or is it just cuts in the rate of spending?
In the rate of growth, I think you're talking about. In Washington, one of the things that would be hugely helpful to Washington talk, and certainly for Americans to understand what happens there, is for us to get rid of what's called the CBO baseline. The CBO baseline projects a growth in spending based on inflation, and you know, you have things like Medicare where you have 20 million more people coming into the program over the next decade. So the baseline actually projects growth, and so if you cut that growth down, that in Washington speak is called a cut. What we ought to do is just have the baseline of spending that exists, and we ought to talk about that. That would be a whole different kind of conversation, something that ought to occur. Actually, the governor of New York just put that type of system into place.
It's interesting that we've been used to listening to the mainstream media talk about, oh no, cuts, 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 when in reality it was just a cut in the rate of growth. There were no real dollars cut. Are we seeing real dollars cut in this situation?
You're slowing the rate of growth.
Okay.
And you're slowing the rate of growth. I mean, there's nothing else you could say about it. Under the present course, we're going to be right now. We are spending relative to our economic output about 24.5% of our gross domestic product. That's at an all-time high. It hasn't been near that level since 1945 when we're ending World War II. On the current course, Dan, we're going to be at 40% of GDP in the not distant future. So the goal is to get that turned around.
Right.
And as I mentioned, if we do what we did last week over and over and over again over the next 10 years, we will actually achieve a balanced budget. And so your debt curve is going to go up and then decline back down. And then from that point forward, if we were able to achieve that, you would continue to drive that down into the ground. But it's going to take, I believe, a decade of tough decisions. And as you know, when you start cutting back, typically the first cuts you make are the low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what happens with you here in county government. The first changes you make, they're the easy ones.
Right.
The next step you make, a little more difficult. Next step you make, a little more difficult. That's why I'm saying that this is going to be the struggle of a decade for our country. There's not going to be just one solution that solves everything, but as a country, as stewards of our country's resources, we have got to do this for this country to continue to be the great nation that it is.
Let's talk about the system that we actually got. Of course, you mentioned earlier that you had introduced the CAP Act, which is Commitment to American Prosperity Act. That was your proposal. I think you introduced it at the beginning of this session.
And at the end of last year.
End of last year.
That's right. That's right.
And I remember you came through Bradley County and explained it in detail with the PowerPoint. It made sense to me.
Right.
But we didn't get that act. Then you were a co-sponsor to the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act.
That's correct.
We didn't really get that either. We got something kind of a Duke's mixture of both, did we? Explain exactly what we did.
Well, what we ended up, you have a cut. There is a cap that's part of this legislation that just passed, but it's only a cap on discretionary spending. And so you're only capping a portion of the federal budget. This year we'll spend 3.6, $3.7 trillion. Only 1.4 trillion of that is discretionary spending. So that discretionary spending is capped, but everything else is not, and everything else is the mandatory and entitlement spending. The CAP Act that I proposed capped everything, okay? And if you did away with all discretionary spending, you couldn't cause the budget to balance. So if you're going to get serious about our country's finances, you have to look at everything. And one of the bigger issues, and all of us want to see Medicare continue on. All of us want to see Dan Howell and others, when they reach retirement age, be able to benefit from it. But here are the numbers on Medicare. The average family in America earns $43,000 a year. Over their lifetime, they and their employer's contribution, the employer puts in half, the employee puts in half. Over their lifetime, they will put into Medicare $109,000. Now I'm speaking in 2011 dollars. In other words, inflating the first dollars that just went in, okay, 40 years ago. The average family, though, so they put in 109, they'll take out $343,000. So the math doesn't work. And so, it's those kinds of things. There are going to be 20 million more Americans going on Medicare over the next decade. You and I are part of the baby boom generation, and there'll be a lot of us who will retire over the next 10 years. And then you've got lesser people working relative to those who are retired. So we've got a compounding problem here that we have got to address so that we know that future generations are going to have that. Well, what we did last week only looks at discretionary spending. It doesn't look at some of these other things that are continuing to grow and create lots of issues that are going to be very problematic.
It's interesting that if my memory serves me best, in history, I think the last time the United States had a balanced budget, I believe, was about 60 years ago under the Eisenhower administration. In just 60 short years, basically 1.5 generations, we've got to this point to where we're in debt by trillions of dollars. How do we get here?
Well, now we actually had some surpluses back in the 90s.
Okay.
So you remember during the latter years of the Clinton administration, there was actually a surplus. So we did have a balanced budget then. What is tricky about a balanced budget is we don't take into account the out years, you know, the fact that we have these actuarial assumptions in Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, where we've got what's called, we might have a current balanced budget that year, but then we've got these unfunded liabilities that are building out in the future. And any of your listening audience that are involved in actuarial assumptions understands that and understands the compounding rate of interest and all that. So you know, how we got here, though, to answer your question, is candidly both parties have taken us here. It's actually you know, it's sort of what you're seeing in Western democracies around the world. I mean, politicians have been elected. They want to give citizens what the citizens want and ask for. They don't ask the citizens to pay for it. The citizens have been happy with that bargain for a while, and in recent times, you know, have become uneasy with that. And then now, obviously, we have this issue. When I was here 4.5 years ago running, I was focused on this issue. I think this is going to be the struggle of a decade as we try to get things back in order. But both parties have contributed. There's no question the last 2 years have put spending on steroids, I would have to say. But it's going to take both parties. Both parties contributed, both parties to get us out of this. And again, years of a lot of discipline and focus and gnashing of teeth as we try to reorient the way the federal government's involvement in citizens' lives is.
The act that was passed finally last week, is there any mandatory discipline in that to curb spending on the part of Congress?
Yes, I mean, there is this cap that I mentioned on some discretionary spending. To me, it's not deep enough, but there's a cap on discretionary spending. There's also something called sequestration. I think you know that there's been a super committee formed. It's going to be, you know, finishing its work in November. If this committee doesn't come up with a minimum of $1.1 trillion in cuts, there's something called sequestration that's going to occur, where there's an automatic taking out of accounts of government. And the way...
Would that be across the board, Senator?
No, there's a formula for it, but it was set up so that it's very painful for Republicans and it's very painful for Democrats. I mean, it was set up purposely to create a lot of pain, and the reason was to force this super committee that's been created to actually come up with a solution in a way that is negotiated and you get a majority vote, and then that would come before the House and the Senate in an expedited process where it would be an up or down vote, no amendments. But obviously the sequestration is a backstop to ensure that spending cuts absolutely occur, but the hopes are that this committee will come up with ways of doing it that, quote, are more elegant or more graceful, but still you still get the cuts that you need to have, and you have those cuts right now.
And this super committee is composed of 6 Republicans, 6
Democrats?
6
Republicans, 6 Democrats, half from the House, half from the Senate. Speaker Pelosi announced the final 3 today. Senator McConnell and Senator Reid announced 6 yesterday, and Speaker Boehner the day before. So the committee's put together, and they will, I'm sure, begin sort of laying out the ground rules as to how they're going to operate. But
do you know who this chairman will be of that committee?
I don't. I mean, my guess is there'll be 2 co-chairmen, one Republican, one Democrat. But I'm hopeful. I'm obviously going to begin my own lobbying effort towards, you know, the minimum goal, Dan, is for them to get $1.5 trillion in cuts. Obviously, I'd like to see something much bigger. Again, I mentioned earlier, I would have liked to have seen $4 trillion in this last package. We got $1 trillion on the front end. I'd like to see them try to push for at least $3 trillion in savings as they move through this.
Are you hopeful that this super committee will function as it's designed?
Well, I'm very hopeful. I mean, you know, who knows? I mean, the mix of the committee obviously has a whole lot to do with it, and I'm not going to give any editorial comment there. I want to really look at the backgrounds, especially of a couple of folks, but you know, yes, I'm hopeful. And, you know, look, I'm hopeful because our country has to deal with this, okay? And it's going to have numbers of efforts like this to get us where we need to go. This is a great nation, but we have not been responsible with our resources. And you know, when our country is downgraded, as we were by Standard & Poor's last week, it's an embarrassment to our country. It should be a wake-up call for all of us that this is a call to action to make sure that this country doesn't go in decline, but we continue to be a country where people's standard of living continues to improve. I don't think that's happening right now. And I think it's not happening because of lack of discipline in Washington. And candidly, Washington, I hate to say this, but it's true, is a reflection of our society. But I think people finally are waking up and understanding that things cannot continue as they are.
There has to be
hopefully this committee will take an important second step, and hopefully there'll be many more steps over the course of this next decade to ensure that we do those things that are fiscally responsible.
A part of the legislation that was being voted on, I think, originally included an amendment for a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. That got kicked out. Any hope of that?
Well,
ever?
we still will have a vote on a constitutional amendment.
Okay.
Okay. The cut cap and balance initial proposal, which I was a co-sponsor of, you know, said you had to have the balanced budget in place prior to.
Okay.
In this case, we still are going to have an expedited vote on it.
Okay. We've got to take a break in just a moment, but let me ask you one more question before we do. What we're seeing in the United States is having a rippling effect around the world. We're a global economy. I saw today, I believe it was, or yesterday, that even France now is in danger of losing their AAA rating, like the United States did. Does this create a sense of urgency when the congressmen and senators look around the world and say, hey, we've really got to do something about this, or we're going to lose our entire way of life?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. Again, you know, there have been a lot of folks saying things about Standard & Poor's downgrade, saying it was politically motivated, saying the methodology was incorrect. To me, the fact that credit rating agencies even have to look at us and contemplate the fact that they might downgrade us, to me, is an embarrassment. I mean, it obviously shows that we are not governing ourselves in an appropriate way. So yes, it's a tremendous call to action. This volatility that we've seen over the last week or 10 days, you know, I'm in small rural counties around the state. You see people where in a lot of these counties, unemployment is higher than it would be here in Bradley County, where there's been so much economic growth. Yeah, I mean, it's highly concerning. I woke up the other morning at 2:30 in the morning, worried about where we're going. So yes, no, it's a tremendous wake-up call. You know, I didn't need the wake-up call. I think, you know, I've been around the state for 15 months with charts and every nook and cranny in the state trying to explain where our country was going on the current course. So I didn't need a wake-up call.
You were already
but hopefully, this will cause Congress to focus even more. And I know that our citizens are so frustrated with the lack of action in Washington. And I feel it and see it everywhere I go. And I tell them, look, as frustrated as they are, I'm even more frustrated because daily, you know, you see the type of inaction that has led us where we are. So I do think that you're going to see more clarity around this and hopefully larger solutions instead of smaller solutions coming.
And the rippling effect, I saw also yesterday that Standard & Poor's has also signals to states and even said some local governments may be downgraded as well. So we may just be seeing the tip of the iceberg here.
Well, look, you know, the state of Tennessee is one of the five states in our country that is whose credit rating is highly dependent on what the federal government says. I've seen the criteria that's used. I got to be honest, it's kind of odd. The state of Tennessee is incredibly well managed, incredibly well managed, always has been. And so to me, for them to link the state of Tennessee's credit rating to the U.S.'s, to me, the linkage there doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just the way it is. So fortunately, Moody's and Fitch still have the U.S. credit rating at AAA. So if two of the three, though, were to downgrade it, that would have a tremendous impact. There's no question that Moody's and Fitch are watching Washington, watching whether we're going to have the discipline to do things we need to do, and you know, that would absolutely, in my opinion, be very devastating if two of the three happen, or three of the three
Sure.
happen to downgrade us. And as you mentioned, it would affect the state of Tennessee,
Yeah.
probably affect a lot of cities and counties around the
Local
state of
government.
Tennessee. The last thing any of us want to see happen.
Yeah, we got to take a break, Senator. Appreciate you coming by. We'll come back with some more questions. Please stay with us. We're talking to United States Senator Bob Corker about the state of our economy. Don't go away.
Kyle Dodge Chrysler Jeep, located at 511 South Lee Highway in Cleveland, is your #1 Dodge Chrysler and Jeep dealer in this area. Stop by and see the brand new 2011 Chrysler 200. The 200 is essentially a new nameplate with a significant facelift to the outgoing 2010 Chrysler Sebring. A beautiful vehicle at an unbeatable price. And while you're there, check out the all-new Jeep Grand Cherokee and the newly designed Dodge Durango. Redesigned, revamped, and reinvigorated. Yes, the Dodge Durango is back, bigger and better than ever. Kyle Dodge Chrysler Jeep offers a complete parts and service department with qualified service technicians to fix and repair your vehicle. So for your next brand new or pre-owned vehicle, make it Kyle Dodge Chrysler Jeep, located at 511 South Lee Highway in Cleveland.
How would you like to look and feel better? If so, then visit the Ford Center for Anti-Aging, located at 2020 Key Street Northwest. Dr. Ford has been serving Cleveland and the surrounding area since 1984. He is a licensed physician with the Board of Anti-Aging Medicine, offering affordable Botox injections. Botox is a medication that is used to treat dynamic wrinkles such as crow's feet, forehead lines, and frown lines. In addition to Botox therapy, rejuvenate and smooth wrinkled skin. The micro laser peel treats skin conditions associated with aging and active lifestyles. If you're looking for safe and affordable anti-aging treatment, call the Ford Center for Anti-Aging at 423-614-0535, located at 2020 Key Street Northwest.
Now's your chance to showcase your small business products or services. The Be Your Own Boss Expo is coming to Bradley Square Mall in Cleveland, Tennessee on Saturday, September the 17th. This expo will provide you with networking opportunities and services to help you grow your small business. Vendors will be able to connect with hundreds of potential clients without the high expense of advertising. If you own a small business in or around Cleveland, Tennessee, you do not want to miss this event. For more information, visit byobexpo.net or call 865-368-1095.
I'm Dr. James Markham, host of the television program Heart of Health, seen right here on WTNB television, Thursday at 7 o'clock, Friday at 8 a.m., or Sunday at 3:30 p.m.
I'm Wes Robbins with Landmark Insurance Brokerage. When it comes to employee benefits, we've got you covered. Call me today for the best service and best solutions to your group health and employee benefits needs. At Landmark Insurance Brokerage, we've got you covered.
And you're watching the Tennessee Valley this morning. Thanks for joining us today. My very special guest is United States Senator Bob Corker, who has joined us today to talk about the debt ceiling, and a lot of other things that impacting our economy in the United States. And we were talking about the CAP Act, the Cut Cap and Balance Act that passed, and some other things. But let's talk about the frustration that you mentioned in the Americans' eyes with Washington. I saw this yesterday. A recent Reuters poll said 73% of Americans believe the nation is on the wrong track. And of that, 50% believe the worst is yet to come. Now, as you say, you woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're worried about it. Americans are really worried about it too. How do you, as a leader, a senator in the United States Senate, go about changing this attitude and the confidence of the American public in the political process?
You know, Dan, first of all, I try to offer solutions. I mean, as you referred to the CAP Act earlier, I mean, you can, as a senator or a House member, you can go out and offer legislation that you know has no chance of passage. You know, it's only oriented in one direction. no chance whatsoever. I constantly am trying to offer solutions that I know can get buy-in on both sides of the aisle. So, you know, I know the American people are frustrated with Congress. I'm frustrated with Congress. It's like, Dan, it's like a big committee. You know, there's 100 senators, there's 435 House members. One's controlled by Democrats, one's controlled by Republicans, and yet both, for a piece of legislation to pass, both bodies have to agree to it, and then the president has to sign it. And so, you know, it's messy business. Right now, you know, one of the reasons that Congress is the way that it is our country is divided. I mean, basically there's an ideological debate that's taking place in Washington. It's playing out, and it's actually very reflective of where the American people are. Yeah. And so, you know, we get emails every day, we get calls every day. It's amazing. Yeah, you know, on the same topic, the difference of opinion that you have coming in and flowing in on that topic. So I think, you know, again, the best way is to, number one, talk straight with folks. You know, as I go around, Dan, I don't ever try to use rhetoric. I never try to use, I also never try to just overtly criticize the other side of the aisle. I mean, I try to say what I think should happen. But the fact is, look, you know, as I mentioned, both parties have gotten our country in the situation it's in. It's going to take both parties to get it out. If I'm constantly out there bashing the other side, spend a lifetime in business. I mean, that's not how you know, get an agreement on a deal or a project or a contract. That's not how you do it. And so I think certainly the discourse in Washington has to change. That doesn't mean, though, that your principles have to change. And the fact is that, you know, there's a couple of ways there's a lot of different ways of solving a deficit problem, but there's no question in my mind we have a huge spending problem in this country. It's getting worse all the time. And I do think that, as you were mentioning the poll, people think the worst is ahead of us. I do think we've turned the ship just a minor amount. Got a lot more to go. And I would say that I think that hopefully the best is yet to come, but a lot of tougher decisions have to be made for that to occur.
Senator, you recently said, a quote from you said, our country is toast if lawmakers fail to slash entitlement programs. You mentioned entitlements
I don't
earlier.
think I used the word slash.
No, I put that in. I'm sorry. I was
okay.
Your quote was, "Our country is toast,"
That's
and
right.
you were referring to the
That's right.
entitlement programs.
Yeah.
But what are we talking about as far as entitlements?
Okay. So there's all kinds of what's called mandatory spending in the budget. A lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of you know, our country is chocked with problems that just whatever sum it takes to pay for this particular, whatever sum that is, that's mandatory spending. In other words, Congress doesn't budget for it each year. If you just set something up, whoever's eligible for it can come in and get it, and whatever that cost is what we're going to spend. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we spent about $3.6 or $7 trillion this year. Only $1.4 trillion of that is what's called discretionary spending. The rest of it is mandatory or entitlement spending. That's where all the money is. That's where all the growth in expenditures is. So I've never used the word slash, but there's no question that we've got to make adjustments and tweak these programs or they're not going to be there for the future. I mean, for Medicare again, we talked about that earlier, but with Medicare, CBO has said that Medicare is going to be insolvent in the year 2024. You and I would both like to see, I think, Medicare be around. So you can put your head in the sand and let it get worse and hit a wall and have a totally insolvent program, or you can begin to make those tweaks that are necessary to keep it in place. That's where the money is. A lot of, again, Americans think they've paid for Medicare, but they haven't. Again, 109,000 in, average family, 343,000 out. The math doesn't work. We've got to tweak it. And there are ways of doing it so that the integrity is kept in place and you do as little harm as possible to those who are receiving those benefits.
What about Social Security in all of this financial dealings that we're talking about? Would Social Security be impacted at all? Should it be tweaked as well?
You know, Social Security is going to have to be tweaked But Social Security is really not driving the big budget deficits that we're talking about over the next 10 years, okay? But it has to be tweaked for it to be maintained. I think you know that, for instance, the age for retirement in Social Security is rising gradually by 1 year up until the year 2027. One of the solutions that's been put forth, again, to keep it actuarially sound, is to raise the retirement age from 2027 to 2050. That's 23 years by 1 year. So you gradually raise it. Again, wouldn't affect people who are retired today. There's also a look at how you do the increases in Social Security. You know, some people have proposed something called the chain CPI, which many people believe more accurately reflects inflation in our country. But there are some tweaks, and I mean real tweaks to Social Security. They're not huge changes where you could really cause it to be solvent for the next 75 years. Those are the kind of things we need to be doing. And for Social Security, the sooner you do it, the easier it is and the almost non-noticeable to those people who are on Social Security today.
We've got about 2 minutes left, Senator. Let's talk about what's happening in Britain briefly. Riots in Britain, the rioters are young, 11 to 18 years old. Commentators describe them as poor, disillusioned, and alienated.
Right.
And one commentator called it the result of years of liberal ideology that eliminated personal responsibility. Can that happen in the United States, do you think?
It can, and you know, obviously none of us want to see that happen, but you know, we saw play out in Greece, a government that was totally irresponsible, let their financial house get totally out of order. You're seeing in England, and people can, by the way, there's lots of reasons I'm sure that people in England are saying what's happening is happening. Okay, it depends on your point of view. But I don't think there's any question that in our country, we have a segment of our population that does feel disillusioned, where there aren't those opportunities, especially people who typically had thought they might earn a living with their hands, and maybe there's not as many opportunities there as in the past. And we have a lot of people who just, I hate to say it, haven't been taught or learned what you just mentioned, and that is the fact that they're going to have to take care of themselves. They're going to have to be personally responsible. So yes, it very well could happen. Again, I think this next decade is going to be a defining moment for our country.
Critical. And
hopefully our citizens and those who represent our citizens will rise to the occasion and ensure that we don't follow down that same path.
Finally, Senator, what's ahead for you? I know you'll be kicking off the campaign soon.
Well, I want to put off kicking off a campaign as long as possible. I really think that, Dan, the best thing I can do is continue to make those tough decisions that I feel need to be made and focus on being a United States Senator. There'll be plenty of time for the other. But, we're in perilous times right now, and I think all of us need to focus on those issues and dealing with them, and I appreciate you letting me come in today and talk with this listening audience about it. A big part of solving problems is ensuring that those that you represent are fully understanding where we are as a country, and I thank you for letting me come in and from my perspective talk about where I think we are as a country.
Well, we're honored that you would take the time. I know you're busy, and I know your staff is busy. I talk to some of them frequently, and appreciate you taking the time to drop by and talk to our viewers here in Bradley County, Ray County, and we look forward to talking to you again when we can talk about a more exciting subject than debt service and debt relief.
Thank you. Thank you.
U.S. Senator Bob Corker. Don't go away. Rob and Ryan back in just a moment as we talk about Lights, Camera, Cleveland.